The first thing Nell Vance sensed was not a sight or a sound, but a strange metallic trace in the air, the faint suggestion of old blood long since dried. She did not smell it in the ordinary sense. Instead, it prickled at the back of her throat like a memory her body recognized but her mind could not explain. The sensation lingered around the massive stone fireplace in the east parlor, clinging to the room like an invisible veil. No one else ever seemed aware of it. To the rest of the household, the air was perfectly ordinary. But to Nell, the mysterious presence drifted constantly from behind the hearth, carried by a draught that persisted no matter the season. Even in the heat of summer, when the house was stifling and the windows stood open, that peculiar current of air continued to slip quietly from the stonework. For years she had dismissed it as nothing more than the scent of ancient masonry and forgotten soot. The mansion was old, after all, and its heavy stonework held many quirks. Yet on a particular autumn evening in 1847, something about it felt different. Gas lamps flickered softly along the walls, their golden glow casting restless shadows across the ornate mantel. As Nell stood in the quiet parlor, a shiver passed through her, a chill that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. For the first time, she felt certain that the fireplace was more than a simple architectural feature. It seemed almost alive in its silence, watchful, patient, as if it guarded something hidden, something deeply troubling that had been waiting for years to be uncovered. And somehow, she sensed that whatever it concealed had the power to unravel the very history of High Falls. But before we continue with the story of High Falls, a small request. If you're enjoying this journey into the past and the mysteries hidden within it, consider subscribing to Cannaling. Your support helps bring more stories like this one to life. And if you have a moment, leave a comment below telling us the city or state you're listening from. We always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, back to High Falls. In 1847, the town rested deep within the lush hills of western Massachusetts. Surrounded by forests and rolling farmland, it was a place shaped by ambition, industry, and the relentless march of progress. At the center of it all flowed the High River, cutting through the town like a living artery. Its powerful current drove the enormous water wheels of the textile mill that dominated the local economy. The mill was the town's heart. From dawn until nightfall, its machinery thundered and hummed, a steady mechanical rhythm that echoed through streets, homes, and fields. The towering brick structure released clouds of steam into the sky, a constant symbol of prosperity and progress. Main Street stretched alongside the river like a dusty ribbon. Along it stood the town's essential buildings, the general store, the blacksmith's shop, and a modest white church whose narrow steeple rose proudly into the sky. A few larger homes belonged to the town's wealthier families. Beyond them stood neat rows of small cottages, so identical wooden houses that sheltered the mill workers. Their lives revolved entirely around the factory's relentless schedule. Above this carefully ordered community stood one man, Edmund Vance. At 41, Edmund was a commanding figure whose reputation carried immense weight throughout High Falls. Tall and broad-shouldered, he dressed in impeccably tailored wool coats that reflected both wealth and authority. His deep voice carried naturally during town meetings, and people listened when he spoke. His generosity further strengthened his standing. He had donated a new bell to the church, funded improvements to the schoolhouse, and contributed regularly to town projects. To many residents, he represented the success and optimism of a growing national an entrepreneur who had transformed cotton into prosperity. Yet Nell, his wife of 2 years, had begun to notice something others overlooked. Behind Edmund's polished public image lingered a guarded expression in his eyes. A subtle tension often tightened his jaw when he thought no one was watching. It was a shadow of something hidden, as something Nell could sense but never fully understand. Nell herself was 34, a woman defined by quiet intelligence and keen observation. To outsiders, her marriage to Edmund appeared ideal. Their wedding had been celebrated across town as the union of two respected families. Though Nell had brought little wealth to the marriage, she possessed a sharp mind and a gentle beauty that drew admiration wherever she went. She managed the Vance household with effortless grace, overseeing the small staff, hosting Edmund's business associates, and maintaining the social balance expected of a mill owner's wife. Yet despite the mansion's elegance, it often felt strangely cold to her. The grand rooms, polished furniture, and expensive DA copyright core sometimes made her feel less like a mistress of the house and more like a decorative piece within it, a resident of a gilded cage. Edmund remained courteous and outwardly affectionate, but a quiet emotional distance always lingered between them. Their conversations rarely ventured beyond practical matters, mill operations, town politics, or the changing weather. The deeper parts of their lives remained untouched. Nell's closest companion in town was Clara Dyer, the local school teacher. At 31, Clara was lively, intelligent, and endlessly curious about the world beyond High Falls. She was rarely seen without a book or newspaper in hand, her spectacles often slipping down the bridge of her nose as she read. Their friendship was a refuge for Nell. When they met for tea, Nell could set aside the expectations placed upon her and simply speak freely. They discussed literature, politics, fashion, and even the growing whispers of the women's rights movement. Their laughter filled quiet rooms with a warmth Nell rarely felt elsewhere. The Vance house itself stood as a symbol of both tradition and ambition. The sprawling Federal-style mansion rested on a gentle hill overlooking the town below. Its white clapboard exterior gleamed in sunlight, framed by dark green shutters that added a stately contrast. Inside, polished mahogany furniture shone beneath soft lamplight. Heavy velvet curtains filtered the daylight, and richly woven Persian rugs softened every footstep. The air often carried the pleasant scent of beeswax polish, dried lavender, and the lingering trace of pipe tobacco drifting from Edmund's study. Yet among all the rooms in the house, one held a peculiar fascination for Nell. The east parlor. Unlike the other formal rooms, it was rarely used for entertaining guests. Dominating the space was an enormous stone fireplace, built from rough-hewn granite blocks that rose nearly to the ceiling. It was a masterpiece of local craftsmanship but also an unsettling presence. The massive stones seemed to swallow both light and sound, casting the room into an uneasy stillness. Edmund had established an unspoken rule about the east parlor. The furniture near the fireplace was never to be moved, and the room itself was never to be redecorated. He simply stated it was perfect as it was, a pronouncement that balked no argument. Nell often felt a peculiar chill emanating from its depths, a cold draught that defied the warmth of the roaring fires they occasionally lit. It was a draught that seemed to carry with it that faint, inexplicable scent, a whisper of something ancient and unsettling. In 1848, a young woman named Abigail Pratt had briefly worked in the Vance household. Abigail, barely 17, was a quiet, diligent girl from one of the mill worker families, her hands quick and her eyes observant. She had been hired to assist with the heavier cleaning tasks, a temporary position that lasted only a few months. Then, one crisp October morning, Edmund announced that Abigail had left for Boston to seek better opportunities. He had even provided her mother, Dorothea Pratt, with an address where Abigail supposedly resided. Dorothea, a woman already stooped by hardship, had clung to this news, sending letters filled with news from High Falls, hopes for her daughter's success, and pleas for a return visit. But no reply ever came. Not a single letter, ever. The silence was a heavy shroud over the Pratt cottage, a silence that Nell, in her own quiet way, had begun to notice. The town, accustomed to the transient nature of mill workers, had quickly forgotten Abigail, but Dorothy Pratt never did, and Nell, though she couldn't articulate why, felt a prickle of unease whenever Abigail's name, or rather her absence, was mentioned. The east parlor, the cold draught, the faint smell, and the missing girl. These threads, desperate as they seemed, were beginning to weave a pattern in Nell's mind, a pattern she was not yet ready to acknowledge. The smell of the mill was a complex symphony. The sharp oily tang of machinery, the sweet, earthy scent of raw cotton, the acrid bite of dyes, and the pervasive dampness of the river. It clung to Edmund's clothes when he returned home, a scent of industry and power. The sound of the water, a constant groaning churn, was the town's heartbeat, a reminder of the relentless march of time and labor. Nell often found herself staring at the east parlor fireplace, tracing the rough texture of its granite blocks, feeling the inexplicable cold that seemed to radiate from its core. She would run her fingers over the intricate carvings on the mantelpiece, a small, almost imperceptible detail that seemed out of place with the otherwise rustic stone. It was a detail that suggested a deliberate artistry, a careful construction rather than an organic part of the house's original design. The wallpaper in the parlor, a rich damask pattern in deep crimson, felt strangely heavy, as if it were trying to absorb the very light from the room, leaving the corners in perpetual shadow. Nell often wondered if the house itself held secrets, if the very walls could speak of what they had witnessed. Her marriage, like the town, was outwardly prosperous, a testament to order and decorum. But beneath the surface, a quiet disk was beginning to stir, a premonition that the carefully constructed facade of Hike Falls, and indeed of her own life, was far more fragile than it appeared. The year was 1851, and the subtle cracks in Nell's carefully constructed world were beginning to widen. The faint metallic smell that she had first noticed years ago, a scent she had tried to rationalize as the residue of old fires, now seemed to intensify on particularly cold nights, especially when a wind howled down the chimney. It wasn't the comforting aroma of wood smoke, nor the musty odor of damp stone. It was something sharper, more acrid, a scent that hinted at decay, yet was not quite rot. It was a smell that made the hairs on her arms prickle, a smell that seemed to emanate directly from the heart of the great stone fireplace in the east parlor. She would often find herself drawn to the room after Edmund had retired, pressing her palm against the cold granite, trying to discern the source of the persistent chill, the origin of that unsettling aroma. One crisp autumn morning, as she supervised the housemaid dusting the parlor, Nell noticed something she had never seen before. On the polished oak floorboards directly in front of the fireplace, partially obscured by the heavy Persian rug, were a series of faint semicircular scratches. They formed an arc, as if a heavy, unyielding object had been dragged across the floor repeatedly in a precise sweeping motion. The marks were old, almost worn smooth, but unmistakable. They suggested that the entire stone structure of the fireplace, or at least a significant portion of it, had been moved, perhaps even pivoted on numerous occasions. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through Nell. Why would anyone move such a massive permanent fixture? And what could possibly be behind it that required such an effort? Later that week, Nell, attempting to broach the subject delicately, mentioned to Edmund her desire to redecorate the east parlor. Perhaps a lighter wallpaper, Edmund, and we could rearrange the furniture to make the room feel less imposing, she suggested, gesturing vaguely towards the fireplace. Edmund, who was usually amenable to her domestic suggestions, reacted with a startling, almost violent anger. His face, usually so composed, flushed a deep crimson, and his eyes, normally calm, narrowed to slits. "The east parlor is perfectly adequate as it is, Nell," he snapped, his voice tight with an unfamiliar fury. "I will not have you meddling with it. Some things are best left untouched." The vehemence of his response, so disproportionate to her innocent suggestion, silenced Nell immediately. But it also ignited a spark of suspicion within her, a tiny ember of doubt that would soon grow into an inferno. His reaction was not merely a preference for decor. It was a fierce, almost desperate defense of the fireplace itself. Clara, during one of her weekly visits for tea, also noticed the peculiar draft. It was a blustery November afternoon, and despite a small fire crackling merrily in the drawing-room fireplace, a distinct chill permeated the east parlor, where they often retreated for more private conversation. "My goodness, Nell," Clara remarked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It feels as though a window has been left ajar in here. Or perhaps your grand fireplace is simply too grand to keep out the cold." She chuckled, attempting to lighten the mood, but Nell did not join her. Instead, she simply stared at the fireplace, a thoughtful, troubled expression on her face. The cold, she knew, was not from an open window. It was from within the wall. The first tangible piece of information, a whisper from the undercurrents of Hike Falls, came from an unexpected source. Thomas Aldred, a young mill worker, barely 28, with a quiet demeanor and intelligent ease, approached Nell one afternoon as she was leaving the general store. He spoke in hushed tones, his gaze darting nervously around. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice barely audible. I feel I must tell you something. It's about Mr. Vance." Nell's heart quickened. "Yes, Thomas," she prompted gently. "Late one night in October of '48, he continued, his eyes fixed on a point beyond her shoulder. "I was working the night shift at the mill. I saw Mr. Vance and Mr. Corbett. They were carrying something heavy into the house through the side entrance near the east wing. It was very late and they looked strained, like they were trying not to be seen." He paused, then added, "It was the same month Abigail Pratt supposedly left for Boston." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implication. Thomas quickly excused himself, disappearing into the throng of mill workers, leaving Nell with a chilling new piece of the puzzle. October 1848. The same month, Abigail vanished. The same month, Edmund and Hiram Corbett were seen carrying something heavy into the house near the east wing where the fireplace stood. The following week, driven by a growing sense of dread, Nell decided to visit Dorothy Pratt. The small cottage, smelling faintly of woods and poverty, was a stark contrast to the Vance mansion. Dorothy, her face etched with years of worry, greeted Nell with a mixture of surprise and deference. After a polite exchange about the weather and the price of flour, Nell gently steered the conversation towards Abigail. "Mrs. Pratt," Nell began, her voice soft. "I was wondering, have you heard from Abigail recently?" "It has been some time." Dorothy's eyes, already clouded with sorrow, welled up. "No, Mrs. Vance," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Not a word. Not a single word since she left." She then shuffled to a small worn wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it she produced a small battered tin box. Inside, neatly stacked, were dozens of letters, their envelopes yellowed and brittle, each one addressed in Dorothy's careful hand to Miss Abigail Pratt, C.O. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, 14 Elm Street, Boston. And on each envelope, stamped in stark red ink, were the words, "Return to sender. Addressee unknown." Dorothy's voice was barely a whisper. "Every letter, Mrs. Vance, every single one. Returned. I sent them for years." "I don't understand." "Edmund said she was there. He gave me the address himself." Nell stared at the stack of returned letters, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Edmund had lied, or at the very least, he had provided a false address. Abigail Pratt had not simply left for Boston. She had vanished. And Edmund Vance was at the center of her disappearance. That night, unable to sleep, Nell found herself at her writing desk, a quill in hand, a blank journal open before her. The gaslight cast a soft glow on the page, but her mind was plunged into shadow. The pieces were beginning to coalesce. The inexplicable draft, the metallic smell, the scratches on the floor, Edmund's furious reaction, Thomas Ulred's hushed confession, and now Dorothy Pratt's returned letters. The weight of this nagging suspicion was almost unbearable. She dipped her quill into the inkwell, her hand trembling slightly, and began to write. Her first entry, a stark declaration of her dawning terror. October 27, 1851. The air in this house, once so comforting, now feels heavy, thick with unspoken things. I have tried to dismiss the peculiar cold that emanates from the east parlor fireplace, the faint, unsettling scent that clings to its stones. I have tried to ignore the strange marks on the floor, the way the light catches them just so, revealing their arc and saw. But tonight, after seeing Mrs. Pratt's returned letters, after hearing Thomas Aldred's quiet confession, I can no longer pretend. Edmund's anger, his insistence that the east parlor remain untouched. It all points to something far more sinister than a mere preference for decor. I do not know what is behind that wall, but I know my husband does, and I fear, with a cold dread that chills me to the bone, that it is connected to Abigail Pratt. The thought is monstrous, unspeakable, yet it persists, a relentless whisper in the quiet corners of my mind. I must know, I must. The journal became her silent confidant, a repository for her burgeoning fears and her meticulous observations. She began to view her husband, her home, and her entire life in Harrock Falls through a new terrifying lens. The outwardly perfect facade of her marriage now seemed brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. She loved aspects of her life, the comfort, the respect, the quiet companionship of Clara Ara, but the questions forming in her mind, dark and insistent, were like a relentless tide, threatening to sweep away everything she held dear. She feared losing her position, her home, her very identity as Mrs. Advance. But a deeper, more primal fear was taking root. The fear of what she might find if she stopped asking questions. The fear of living a lie, of being complicit in a silence that felt increasingly like a grave. The shadows in the Vance house were growing longer, and Nell knew with a chilling certainty that they were not merely cast by the setting sun. If this story already has you wondering what was really happening behind those walls of the Vance house, you're not alone. Drop a comment below with your theory so far. What do you think Edmund was hiding? And if you haven't already, hit that like button. It means the world to us and helps this story reach more people who love dark history. The years that followed, from 1852 to 1855, were a slow, agonizing descent into a labyrinth of suspicion for Nell. Her initial dread solidified into a grim determination. She moved with a quiet purpose, her outward demeanor unchanged, but her inner world a maelstrom of investigation. She began to cultivate new alliances, seeking knowledge in the most unexpected places. Her first target was Reverend Gideon Halt. The Reverend, a man of 58 with a kindly scholarly air, was the keeper of Harrock Falls' spiritual and historical records. His study, a dusty sanctuary behind the church, was filled with ancient ledgers, brittle deeds, and meticulously kept baptismal records. Nell, feigning an interest in the town's founding families for a supposed genealogical project, began to spend hours with him. Reverend Hall, flattered by her attention, was an unwitting fountain of information. He showed her the town's original property deeds, tracing the lineage of land ownership back to the colonial era. It was during one of these sessions, poring over a faded map of the Vance estate, that Nell made a crucial discovery. Among the records of Edmund's various land acquisitions and improvements, Reverend Holt produced a deed of purchase from 1847, a year before Abigail's disappearance. It detailed a structural modification to the east wing of the Vance house. The contractor listed was a man named Peter Goff. The deed specified the construction of a new substantial stone hearth and chimney flue. Reverend Holt recalled the man vaguely. Goff, he mused, tapping a finger on the document. Yes, a skilled mason came through Harrock Falls for that job, then moved on. Never heard from him again after that. Nell's heart pounded. 1847, the year Edmund married her, the year the great stone fireplace was built. It was not original to the house. It was an addition, a deliberate construction. Armed with this new information, Nell confided in Clara Ara. Her friend, initially skeptical, grew increasingly alarmed as Nell laid out her meticulous findings. The draft, the smell, the scratches, Edmund's anger, Thomas Aldridge's sighting, Dorothea's letters, and now the fireplace's true age. Clara Ara, with her sharp, logical mind, immediately understood the implications. Together they began to search the county land records, a far more arduous task than Nell's gentle inquiries with Reverend Hall. They spent weeks poring over dusty maps and legal documents in the county seat, their fingers stained with ink and age. And there it was in the original architectural plans of the Vance house, dated 1810. The east wall of the house, where the fireplace now stood, had once featured a small exterior door leading to what was then a modest storage cellar. That door, according to the 1847 modification plans, had been bricked over, and the fireplace constructed directly in front of it. The realization hit Nell with the force of a physical blow. The fireplace was not just built over something. It was built over a door that led to a cellar. A cellar that could be sealed. The growing web of suspicion tightened further in the spring of 1853. Thomas Aldred, the mill worker who had bravely shared his observation with Nell, quietly disappeared from Harrock Falls. Deputy Wallace, or a man of 45 whose loyalty to Edmund Vance was well known, filed a rank to report. Thomas Aldred left of own accord seeking employment elsewhere. But Thomas's mother, a frail woman with eyes as haunted as Dorothea Pratt, sought Nell out. He would never leave without saying goodbye. Mrs. Vance, she sobbed, clutching Nell's hand. He was a good son. He always wrote. He wouldn't just vanish. Nell knew. She knew Thomas hadn't left of his own accord. He had known too much. He had seen too much. And now he too was gone, swallowed by the same silence that had claimed Abigail. Desperate for any shred of hope, Nell decided to take a bold step. She wrote to Boston herself, not to the address Edmund had given Dorothea, but to the city registry office, a formal inquiry. She asked if any record existed of an Abigail Pratt residing in the city since 1849, providing a detailed description of the young woman. 3 agonizing months later, a reply arrived. The sight was a punch to the gut, a horrifying confirmation of their darkest fears. "My God," Reverend Holt breathed, his voice. Nell, her hands raw and bleeding, reached for the bolts. They were stiff, rusted, but with a surge of adrenaline she began to turn them one by agonizing one. The creak of metal, the groan of the old hinges echoed in the silent parlor, each sound a hammer blow to their collective conscience. Finally, with a last desperate pull, the iron door swung inward, revealing a black cavernous space beyond. Claruara raised the candle, its feeble light piercing the oppressive darkness. What they saw inside stole their breath, freezing them in place. It was a small room, barely 9 feet by 7, carved from the old wine cellar. The air was thick, stagnant, heavy with the smell of decay and damp earth. In one corner, a mattress rotted to nothing but a few tattered threads and springs lay on the cold, damp floor. Beside it, a tin cup, corroded and green with verdigris. A small leather-bound Bible, its pages eaten away by moisture and time, lay open, its words illegible. And on the stone wall, scratched with what must have been a nail or a hairpin, were hundreds of marks, tally marks counting the days. And below them, repeated over and over, a name etched with desperate, furious strokes, Abigail. And beneath her name, in careful, deliberate letters, a message that sent a fresh wave of horror through Nell. She was alive in here. Someone knew. Someone brought food. The room was empty of a body. Abigail was not there. This realization, instead of bringing relief, brought a new, more terrifying question. If she had been alive, if someone had known, if someone had brought her food for years, then where was she? And who was this mysterious benefactor? The implications were staggering. A new layer of deception and complicity. Nell, her mind reeling, began to search the small, damp space by candlelight. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, scanned every inch of the stone walls, the earthen floor, and then, beneath the loose floor stone near the back wall, she found it. A folded piece of paper, brittle with age, but miraculously preserved from the worst of the damp. It was in Abigail's handwriting, unmistakable from the few letters Dorothea had shown her. It was a confession, not of her own wrongdoing, but of what she had witnessed. October 17, 1848. I write this in the dark with a piece of charcoal I found, praying someone will one day find it. I must record what I know. I discovered Mr. Vance and Mr. Corbett in the study late at night. They were discussing ledgers, maps, and deeds. I saw them forging signatures, altering documents. They were stealing land, madam, from the mill workers, from the very families who toil for them. They were taking their small plots, their inheritance, through fraudulent means, replacing legitimate deeds with false ones. I saw it with my own eyes. I heard their plans. I confronted Mr. Vance. I told him I would not stand by and watch them rob these poor families. He smiled, a cold, terrible smile, and said he would handle the matter quietly. I thought he meant he would cease his activities. I was wrong. He meant he would silence me. He brought me down here to this cellar under the pretense of a task. He locked the door. He told me I would stay here until I learned to keep my mouth shut. I heard the masons working above, sealing the door. I heard the fireplace being built. I am trapped. I am cold. I am afraid. but I will not be silent. I will not let them win. May God help me. Abigail Pratt. Nell finished reading, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped the paper. Fraud, land theft. And Abigail, a young girl, had stumbled upon their monstrous scheme. Edmund had not just imprisoned her. He had silenced her to protect his ill-gotten gains. The depths of his depravity were unfathomable. But then another discovery: in a crack in the stone wall near where Abigail's name was scratched, Nell found a small iron key. It was crude, clearly handmade, but it was a key, and it was made to fit the bolt lock on the iron door. Someone had possessed a key. Someone had been able to open the door from the outside. And scratched beside Abigail's name on the wall in different handwriting, smaller, more careful, almost hidden, were two initials: Tar Thomas Aldred. Thomas Aldred, the mill worker who had disappeared in 1853. Thomas Aldred, who had seen Edmund and Hiram carrying something heavy into the house in October 1848. Thomas Aldred, who had known Abigail was there. He had been feeding her. He had possessed a key. He had somehow gotten her out. And then he too had vanished. The implications cascaded, a dizzying torrent of possibilities. Abigail might be alive. Thomas might be alive. And Edmund knew that someone had gotten her out. He had known for years. He had simply allowed the town to believe she was gone and that Thomas had left, maintaining his facade of respectability while knowing the truth of their escape. Nell, Clara Ara, and Reverend Holt, their faces grim, carefully sealed the room back as best they could, replacing the loose stones, obscuring the evidence of their intrusion. The secret they knew could not remain hidden for long. Reverend Hall, his resolve hardened by the night's discoveries, returned to his study. He wrote a letter that night, not to the local authorities, but directly to the circuit court in Springfield, Massachusetts. He enclosed Peter Gough's detailed confession, Abigail's own harrowing account, and a meticulous description of the physical evidence they had found in the hidden room. He detailed the fraudulent land transactions, the disappearance of Abigail and Thomas, and the complicity of Edmund Vance. 3 days later, Edmund returned from Boston. He walked into the east parlor, his eyes immediately drawn to the fireplace. He noticed the subtle shift in the mortar, the faint dust on the rug. He found Nell standing by the window, her back to him, her posture rigid. "Nell," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "It seems you have been busy in my absence." Nell turned, her eyes meeting his devoid of fear, filled only with a cold, unwavering resolve. "I have been busy, Edmund. I have been busy uncovering the truth." Edmund's face remained impassive, but his eyes, Nell wrote in her journal that night, were the eyes of a man who has already calculated every outcome and found all of them acceptable. The eyes of a predator who knows he has been discovered but believes he is still beyond reach. The conversation that followed was chilling, a testament to Edmund's unshakable composure and Nell's newfound strength. "The truth, Nell," Edmund scoffed, a faint, dismissive smile playing on his lips. "And what truth might that be?" "That you have been meddling in matters far beyond your understanding. That you have defiled my property." "The truth, Edmund," Nell replied, her voice steady. "Of Abigail Pratt, of Thomas Aldred, of the room behind that fireplace, of the fraudulent deeds." "I know everything." Edmund took a step closer, his gaze piercing. "You know nothing, Nell. You have allowed your imagination to run wild." A girl left for Boston. A worker sought new opportunities. A fireplace is a fireplace. You will say nothing of this. You will forget what you think you have seen for your own good. For the good of this family, for the good of Hike Falls, the good of Hike Falls, Nell retorted, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Or the good of Edmund Vance. Your secrets are no longer safe, Edmund. The truth has a way of finding its light, no matter how deeply it is buried." Edmund simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. "You will regret this, Nell," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You will regret this more than anything you have ever done." Nell met his gaze unflinching. "Perhaps, but I will not live with your lies any longer." The battle lines were drawn. The silence of Hike Falls was about to be shattered. The circuit court in Springfield, Massachusetts, received Reverend Holt's meticulously documented letter, and the quiet, ordered world of Hike Falls began to unravel. The initial response was one of disbelief, then cautious inquiry. Judge Elias Fenn, upon learning of the investigation, immediately attempted to suppress the inquiry, leveraging his long-standing connections within the legal establishment. He argued that the accusations were baseless, the ramblings of a hysterical woman and an overzealous minister. However, Reverend Holt, with a foresight born of deep suspicion, had sent his letter directly to the state level, bypassing the local circuit entirely. His careful planning ensured that the investigation, once initiated, could not be easily dismissed or buried. The state authorities, recognizing the gravity of the allegations and the detailed evidence provided, overruled Judge Fenn, and a full investigation was launched. The first casualty of the unfolding scandal was Deputy Wallace. In the spring of 1861, he resigned from his post without explanation. His departure swift and silent. The town whispered, but no one dared to speak openly of the true reasons behind his sudden exit. His loyalty to Edmund Vance, once a mark of his character, now seemed a stain. Edmund Vance was formally charged with unlawful imprisonment, fraud, and obstruction of justice. He was brought before the court in Springfield in September 1861. The trial, a sensational affair that drew spectators from across the state, lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom, usually a somber place of legal procedure, became a theater of human drama. Nell Vance, composed and resolute, was the first key witness for the prosecution. She recounted her years of growing suspicion, her meticulous investigation, the discovery of the scratches, the returned letters, the ironmonger's receipt, and finally the harrowing night they opened the hidden room. Her testimony was delivered with a quiet dignity that lent immense credibility to her astonishing claims. Mrs. Vance, the prosecutor, a sharp-witted young man named Mr. Davis, asked, "Can you describe for the court the condition of the room you discovered behind the fireplace?" Nell's voice, though soft, carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. It was small, barely 9 feet by 7, damp. The air was thick with the smell of decay. There was a rotted mattress, a corroded tin cup, and a Bible, its pages ruined by moisture. And on the wall, etched into the stone, was the name Abigail, repeated many times, and below it the words, "She was alive in here." Someone must have known a broken bar, someone must have been bringing her food. Those quiet words echoed through the courtroom before the next witness was called. Peter Goff, the mason who had worked on the Vance house years earlier, slowly approached the stand. His face carried the weight of long-buried guilt. When he spoke, his voice trembled slightly, yet there was also a strange relief in finally telling the truth. His testimony confirmed Nell's account in chilling detail. Goff explained how Edmund Vance had personally commissioned him to construct a concealed chamber behind the massive fireplace in the east parlor. He presented old architectural sketches he had preserved and now entered as official evidence here, which clearly showed the design of the iron door and the heavy exterior bolts used to seal it shut. When he finished, Edmund's attorney, the sharp-tongued Mr. Blackwood, rose slowly from his seat. Blackwood was known throughout the state as a brilliant and relentless courtroom strategist. "Mr. Goff," he said, his voice calm but cutting, "you claim that Mr. Vance hired you to build what amounts to a prison cell. Yet you accepted payment, completed the construction, and remained silent for more than a decade." He paused before continuing. "If you truly believed a crime was being committed, why did you not speak sooner?" Goff swallowed hard before answering. "I was young," he said quietly. "I needed work." Mr. Vance was the most powerful man in Hike Falls. "I convinced myself it was only a secure storage room, a broken bar, a vault." His voice grew heavier. "But after I sealed that door, a broken bar, the silence haunted me. I could never forget it." Goff explained that he eventually left Hike Falls because he could not live with what he had done. "It was Mrs. Vance's letter," he continued, glancing briefly toward Nell, "and the knowledge that others were finally searching for the other broken bar that gave me the courage to come forward." Throughout this testimony, Edmund Vance remained perfectly still. His expression never changed. His face appeared calm, controlled, almost indifferent, as if the entire trial were nothing more than an inconvenience. His defense was simple and unwavering. Abigail Pratt, he insisted, had left town willingly years ago. She was a restless young woman who wanted adventure beyond Hike Falls. The hidden room, he argued, had simply been built as a secure vault to protect valuable documents and business records. The scratched markings, the hidden confession, the letters found inside the chamber, according to him, were nothing more than fabrications. A scheme, a plot created by his estranged wife and her allies to destroy his reputation and seize his wealth. When Edmund spoke, his voice was calm, confident, almost persuasive. Beside him, Mr. Blackwood skillfully reinforced the story, painting a picture of marital bitterness, betrayal, and false accusations. The town of Hike Falls watched the trial closely, and the community became deeply divided. Some people refused to believe their respected mill owner could be capable of such cruelty. Others were shaken by the mounting evidence. Then, just 6 days before the jury was expected to deliver its verdict, something extraordinary happened. Our letter arrived at the courthouse in Springfield. The envelope bore a postmark from Portland, Maine. It was addressed directly to the presiding judge, and its contents stunned everyone who read it. The letter was signed by a woman named Abigail Aldred, formerly known as Abigail Pratt. The letter began, Portland, Maine, September 28, 1861, to the Honorable Judge of the Circuit Court in Springfield, Massachusetts. I recently learned through a notice printed in the Portland Gazette that Edmund Vance is currently standing trial in connection with my disappearance from Hike Falls. For 12 years I have lived quietly under a different name, believing no one would ever believe what truly happened to me. But now it appears the walls that once imprisoned me have begun to reveal their secrets. My name is Abigail Aldred, though I was once Abigail Pratt, the girl who vanished from Hike Falls in October of 1848. I did not leave willingly. Edmund Vance imprisoned me in a hidden chamber behind the fireplace in his home. The letter described how Abigail had discovered fraudulent documents showing that Vance was secretly stealing land from mill workers through forged deeds. When she confronted him, he led her into the cellar. There, she was forced inside the hidden room. The iron door slammed shut. The outer bolts were sealed, and she was left in darkness. Abigail wrote that she survived inside the room for nearly 5 years. She counted the passing days by scratching marks into the stone wall. She wrote a desperate message and hid it beneath a loose stone, praying someone would one day find it. The only reason she survived was because of one man, Thomas Aldred, a mill worker who had accidentally discovered the narrow ventilation shaft connected to the hidden chamber. Realizing someone was trapped inside, he risked his life every day by secretly bringing food and water. Over time, Thomas managed to craft a crude key capable of opening the exterior bolts. In the spring of 1853, during one of Edmund Vance's trips away from town, Thomas removed the bolts and freed her. Together they fled Hike Falls under cover of darkness. They hid in the back of a supplely wagon traveling to Providence. Eventually they reached Portland, Maine. There they married and began new lives together, always living quietly, always afraid Edmund Vance might somehow discover them. Abigail explained why she had remained silent for so many years. I knew the power Edmund Vance held, she wrote, and I feared no one would believe the word of a simple mill worker's daughter against his. She ended the letter with a promise. She was prepared to travel to Springfield and testify in person. May justice finally be served. The news spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Abigail Pratt was alive. 2 days later, she arrived in Springfield. She was 30 years old. Hardship had changed her, but there was no doubt she was the same young woman who had disappeared 12 years earlier. When she entered the courtroom, a deep silence settled over the crowd. The quiet was so intense that the scratching of a clerk's pen sounded like thunder. Then something remarkable happened. For the first time during the entire trial, Edmund Vance lost his composure. When he saw Abigail standing in the courtroom, his eyes widened in unmistakable shock. For a brief moment, the carefully crafted mask of control slipped away. Mr. Davis, the prosecutor, spoke gently. Miss Aldrida Brokenbar, can you tell the court what happened to you in October of 1848? Abigail's voice was calm but firm. She described discovering the fraudulent land documents. She told the jury about confronting Edmund Vance. She described the moment he led her into the cellar, the iron door slamming shut behind her, and the sound of masons sealing the wall above. She spoke of the endless darkness, the cold, the despair, the endless counting of days scratched into stone, and the fragile hope that returned each time Thomas secretly delivered food through the narrow shaft. Her testimony was more than a statement of facts. It was a powerful story of survival. When Mr. Blackwood attempted to challenge her account, his voice lacked its usual confidence. You claim Mr. Vance imprisoned you, he said carefully. Yet you stand here alive today. How do you explain that? Abigail looked directly at him. I am alive, she said quietly, because Thomas Aldred risked everything to save me. Not because Edmund Vance showed mercy. He left me there to die. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. Their verdict was unanimous. Edmund Vance was found guilty on every charge. He was sentenced to 14 years in the Massachusetts State Prison at Charlestown, a punishment that effectively ended his life as a free man. Judge Elias Fenn, whose actions had previously delayed the investigation and suggested possible complicity, was removed from the bench. His once respected name quietly disappeared from town records. Thomas Aldred briefly returned to Hike Falls once more. During a ceremony at the town church, Reverend Hall publicly thanked him for his extraordinary courage. Thomas simply nodded, a quiet man uncomfortable with attention. Afterward, he and Abigail returned to Portland to continue the life they had built together. The estate of Hiram Corbett, Vance's business partner, was eventually liquidated. The funds were distributed to mill workers whose land had been illegally seized. It was a small measure of justice after years of exploitation. The Vance house itself was sold. Once a proud symbol of wealth and power, it now carried the shadow of a terrible secret. The new owners permanently sealed the east parlor. The room was never used again. Nell Vance, having finally exposed the truth, kept detailed journals of everything she had uncovered. In 1863 she quietly published them under a pseudonym, A Woman of Hike Falls. The small book, titled The East Wall, circulated through churches across Massachusetts. It told the full story, an unflinching account of corruption, silence, and courage. The story ends with Nell standing at the window of a modest boarding house in Northampton in the autumn of 1863. She had left Hike Falls behind. The mansion, the whispers, the ghosts. Cool autumn air drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant forests. For the first time in 16 years, the air felt clean. It did not carry the chill of that stone wall. It did not carry the metallic taste of old blood. And it did not carry the suffocating weight of secrets. For the first time in years, a broken barn, Nell Vance was finally free. The hidden room behind the fireplace had changed the history of Hike Falls forever. It revealed not just one man's crime here, but an entire structure of silence that allowed it to continue. Because sometimes the most terrifying walls are not made of stone. They are built from silence. What do you think about this story? Was every truth truly uncovered? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy dark historical mysteries like this one, be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share the story with someone who loves forgotten history. We'll see you in the next